Sahana vavatu, Sahanau bhunaktu, Sahaviryam karavavahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu, ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. May Brahman protect us both, the teacher and the disciple. May he nourish us both. May we both work together with great energy. May our studies be vigorous and fruitful. May we not hate or criticize each other. Om. Peace, peace, peace. Now we have come to we are dealing with the last chapter of the Yoga Sutras, chapter 4. And today we will look at the Sutras 24 to 28. In this last chapter, Patanjali is dealing with the mind. Raja Yoga is a science of mind. So in this chapter, he is not giving us any practical things to do, but he is explaining how the mind works, the true nature of the mind, its limitations and its potentialities. In the previous sutra, sutra number 19, Patanjali stated that the mind is not self-luminous because it is an object. It is only because the Purusha is behind, Purusha, the Atman, the Self, which is ever-changing, it is unchanging. That Purusha is behind it, so the mind becomes conscious. Otherwise, mind is an unconscious entity. It is just because the Purusha is behind it that the mind becomes conscious. And again, we saw in another sutra, Sutra 22, that when the mind takes the form of the Purusha, it becomes conscious. Mind has got this particular nature that mind takes the form of whatever you put in the mind. If you put in good thoughts, the mind takes the form of those thoughts. If you put bad thoughts, mind takes that form. If you have Purusha, the idea of Purusha in the mind takes the form of Purusha. And when the mind takes the form of Purusha, it becomes conscious. Now, if the mind is not luminous, how does it understand things? How does the mind understand things? So in the previous Sutra, Sutra 23, Patanjali said, colored by the seer and the seen, the mind is able to understand everything. Because the mind takes the color of the seer and the seen. Seen is the objects outside, external objects. Taking these two together, the mind understands things. So now he continues his explanation of the mind. So we come to Sutra 24. Tad asankhyeya vasanabhihi chitramapi parartham samhatya karitvat. The mind, though variegated by innumerable desires, acts for another. The another is the Purusha, because it acts in combination. The mind, though variegated by innumerable desires, there are innumerable desires in our mind, but the mind is acting for another person. It's acting for the Purusha. What's the reason? Because it acts in combination. The desires could be for the grossest physical pleasures or indulgences, or it could be refined knowledge, or subtle, higher spiritual realms. As we try to fulfill these various objects, we notice that as we evolve, the nature of the objects that we seek also change. As we evolve, then what we like to get also changes. For example, a child Child is interested, child wants to get toys, playthings. But a grown-up, say a youth, is not interested in toys. He or she has got other interests. The thing they seek is different. So in the unevolved person, a rude, crude person, what will be his or her objects of desire, or the desires will be for gross physical pleasures. As the person evolves, get education and evolves, then the things that they seek also change. They may be seeking refined knowledge, aesthetic enjoyments, arts, music, literature. It changes. And a spiritually advanced person, they may be seeking the bliss of spiritual realm. So as we evolve, the nature of the things that we seek also changes. So what exactly are we seeking? Are we seeking the toys, or intellectual knowledge, or spiritual bliss? What are we seeking? Are we trying are we trying to get all this for our own sake? Patanjali says what we really seeking for is the Purusha. We are seeking for Purusha, but we think that we get that Purusha, the bliss. Purusha is the embodiment of bliss. You have to remember Vedanta speaks of Atman as existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute. Purusha is full of bliss. And that's a bliss that we are seeking, but through different things, because of our ignorance, because of our lack of understanding. It is hidden behind all these attractive things that we see in the world. Purusha is behind all that. And it is that Purusha that we are seeking, but we think that we get that happiness, the bliss from these things. And again, it is not for the objects of enjoyment that we seek them, but for the sake of the Purusha. This Purusha is bliss, not the objects. The objects don't give us bliss. It is because Purusha is there, we give us bliss. So it is for the sake of Purusha that we seek all these different objects, whether it's crude physical pleasures or intellectual enjoyment or spiritual bliss. It's all the seeking for the sake of Purusha. We see a similar idea in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Says, the sage Yajnavalkya says, the husband is loved not for the sake of the husband, but for the sake of the self. The wife is loved not for the sake of the wife, but for the sake of the self. So we are seeking all these things for the sake of the Purusha. Now, how do we know that we are seeking all these things for the sake of the Purusha? Because the objectives keep changing. And we are never satisfied with whatever we are getting. Whatever be the attainments, however subtle, however evolved they are, we are not satisfied. We get it, but we are not satisfied. We will seek something more. So we are seeking the Purusha. And only realizing the Purusha will give us abiding peace. So till we get that, we keep on changing, evolving, and seeking more and more subtle things. The mind tries to fulfill all these innumerable desires, thinking that it will have peace. But peace is in the self alone, in the Atman alone. That is why Patanjali says, the mind acts for another. Mind is not acting for itself, it's acting for another. And another reason to say that the mind is not acting for itself is the mind is not an independent entity. It is a combination. Since it is a combination, it doesn't have any independence. Somebody is making it do. So Swami Vivekananda, explaining this sutra, says, the mind is a compound of various things, and therefore it cannot work for itself. The mind is a combination. If you examine your mind, just on the surface level, how many thoughts we have. But The moment that if you think deeply for a longer time, we can see so many things coming from the deeper levels. So mind is a compound of various things, and therefore it cannot work for itself. Everything that's a combination in this world has some object for that combination, some third thing for which this combination is going on. So this combination of the mind is for the Purusha. That is, this one idea is giving. All combinations are for the sake of someone else. Say, for example, you say, I take hot water, milk, sugar, coffee powder, mix it in a cup. Is it for the cup? It's not for the cup, it's for a person, it's for a third person. All combinations in this world are not for itself, it's for somebody else, something else. So the mind is acting not for itself. It seems that the mind is acting for itself. It's an independent mind. It's not. It is acting for the sake of the Purusha. Then Patanjali goes further. The next sutra. Vishesha darshana atma bhava bhavana nivrittihi. Vishesha darshana atma bhava bhavana nivrittihi. For the discriminating, the perception of the mind as Atman ceases. The discriminating person, the person who has got the habit of deep thinking, for those who discriminate, who reasonable, the idea that the mind is a self, the mind and the self are the same, that idea ceases. Here Patanjali uses a special term, Vishesha Darshana. Vishesha Darshana means people who think clearly, who think deeply. We don't think deeply. We are floating on the surface level. We don't think deeply. And ordinary people do not even understand that the body-mind complex is changing all the time. We think we are the same. Oh yes, we are the same. It is constantly changing. And we don't see the change immediately. So a child growing up, we don't see. But gradually it is changing all the time. We know that. We see it. But we are not always conscious of that change. The mind is also changing, body is also changing. But there is one thing which doesn't change at all. We always say, I. When I was a child, when I'm old, I is there all the time, unchanged. People with deep thinking realize that. Who think deeply realize that what is that which does not change in me. I'm the one. I is the one entity which does not change. Over the years, it hasn't changed. Whether I was a baby, a child, youth, adult, old, the I is the same. The body and mind has changed. The I hasn't changed. And they come to realize that the unchanging factor in all through the journey of life is the awareness, the I consciousness. And that consciousness is in everybody. It's not just in one person, it's everywhere, every living being, that I consciousness is there. So that's why we love one another, because same I is in all. We actually don't think deeply. That's why Patanjali says this, uses the term Vishesha Darsana, those who think deeply. We think just out of necessity, whatever is extreme necessary, only that much we think. How many of us just sit quietly and think? No, we don't do that. We are rushing. We are so busy rushing around from one thing to another. The mind, just as the body is rushing from one thing to another, one place to another, the mind also is rushing all the time. We don't sit quietly and think. There's a very humorous saying by Bernard Shaw. He says, most people don't think. I think twice a week. So I'm internationally famous. So people don't think. Through long practice, the intellect develops the power of sharp thinking. If you don't practice, you don't have the power to think deeply. That is why in our order, we insist that those who come to take the monastic life should be educated. Only through education, you get the power to think deeply. In olden times, there are many people who became monastics without any education. They study script, they learn, hear about scriptures, but they haven't gone through education of, say, curriculum, school or university, whatever it is. But now we insist, because that develops the critical thinking. Through long practice, intellect develops the power to think deeply. And when that power reaches its highest state, the Yoga says, it's got a technical term, Viveka Khyati. It gains discriminative knowledge, Viveka Khyati. And at this stage, when you reach that stage, the yogi can clearly see there's a distinction between nature and consciousness. And he realizes, the yogi realizes that I am not the body, the mind, the senses, the intellect. As Shankaracharya in the Nirvana Shatkam says, Mano Buddhi Ahankara Chittani Naham. I am not the body, I am not the mind, I am not the senses, I am not the chitta. I am that supreme reality, existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute. The world becomes meaningful to us because we identify with it. When the moment we don't stop identifying, the world ceases to have any meaning to us. We identify. There's different levels of identification is there. Sometimes we identify with the body. I am the body. Or I'm the body. That's the only idea that we say. It's actually the animal stage. Even though you are a human being, got a human body, still the stage is animal stage, identifying with the body. There's nothing higher than that. There is no thought higher than that of the body. The body is everything. Creature comforts are the be-all and end-all of life. I have to have pleasures, physical pleasures, bodily pleasures, sensual pleasures. That's the only aim in life. That's identifying with the body. Then as the person evolves a little more, then the person identifies with the mind. I am the mind. I'm not the body, I'm the mind. So has got some knowledge, uses reasoning, and uses the mind to face challenges and problems. When problems comes, using the mind, reasoning, face it, tackles with it, instead of running away from the problems. Then there's still higher stages, identification with the self. No more the body, no more identification with the body or the mind, but the identification is with the pure self. And this identification is the cause of all the problems. We identify with some things, we identify with things, we identify with people, and it causes problems. Sometimes we refuse, some people refuse to grow up. They want to remain young. They have physically become older, but still behave like a young child, a child or a youth. So we will say, grow up, be mature, don't behave like a child. We are identifying with that, we don't want to grow up. All this identification causes problem. We identify with people, we identify with things. Say a person identifies with the house. This is my house. If something happens to the house, I'm completely gone. Because of the identification, I'm not the house. The house came only some time back. Or I came to that house only some time back. I didn't bring that house with when I was born into this world. But we identify and cause problem for us. So people think that if you don't identify, how can you work? Of course we can work. Identification is slavery. We become bound with that because of identification. And we think that with identification we can work properly. If there is no identification, then there is efficiency in work. That's what Bhagavad Gita says, Sri Krishna says in the Gita, detached. Work without attachment. Identification means attachment. We are attached to a particular thing, idea, people, then we are not efficient. Without attachment, we work, then there is efficiency. We have to live in the world. Live in the world, but don't bring in the world inside you. It's like, let the boat be in the water, but don't bring in water into the boat. If the water is in the boat will sink. If the world is in us, we will sink in the world. Be in the world, but don't bring in the world inside us. In the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we can see when Yam, in the early days on one of his early visits, he asked Sri Ramakrishna, how should one live in the world? Sri Ramakrishna says, be unattached. Live with all your family, your wife, children, for parents, brothers, sisters, all. But look upon them as though you are a custodian. You treat them as though they are your very own. That's one word I like very much. As though. Not that they are your very own. As though they are your very own. But remember that your relation to them is only through God. God is your own, nobody else. That means live in the world, but don't be attached. That with the deep thinking, we come to realize that the mind and the self are two separate entities. They are not the same. Don't get identified with the mind. Then Patanjali says, Tada viveka nimnam kaivalya pragbhavam chittam. Tada viveka nimnam kaivalya pragbhavam chittam. Then, bent on discriminating, the mind attains the previous state of kaivalya. Kaivalya, Swamiji has translated as isolation, liberation. Through continued practice, bent on practice, discriminating means continued practice of discrimination, continued practice of deep reasoning. The mind remains completely immersed in the viveka dhyati, that is discriminative knowledge. And this is the stage that comes immediately before kaivalya, the attainment of kaivalya or liberation, freedom. Before reaching this exalted state, the mind is attracted more to the pleasures of the world. When free from prejudices, then it moves towards, free from prejudices, free from identification, the mind moves towards the Purusha. The mind becomes free and liberated through constant practice of discrimination. Here Patanjali is, towards the end of the Yoga Sutra, he is stressing again and again two things: detachment and discrimination. Discrimination, discernment, reasoning. Through constant practice of discrimination, the mind becomes free. Earlier, they may have occasional glimpse of that freedom, but that occasional glimpse of that reality becomes an abiding factor through continued practice of discrimination. So Swamiji explains it. Thus, the practice of yoga leads to discriminating power, to clearness of vision. The veil drops from the eyes and we see things as they are. At present, we have got veils over our eyes. We have put colored glass. So we see all things colored. We have got a lot of biases and prejudices. That is, we are wearing colored glass. So we see the things, the whole world with that color, the color of the glass that we are wearing. But through practice of discrimination, constant practice, continuous practice, not just do it for one day, for half an hour, and then go around back to your original state. No, it won't do. For continuous practice of discrimination, we get that clear vision. Veils drop from the eyes and we see things as they are. At present, how do we see the world? We don't know what's out there. We see the world, whatever is out there, through our understanding, through our colored glass of the mind. But when that prejudices are removed, when we get clearness of vision, we see things as they are. Swamiji is continuing here. We find that nature is a compound and is showing the panorama for the Purusha, who is the witness. That nature is not the Lord. That all the combinations of nature are simply for the sake of showing the panorama to the Purusha, the enthroned king within. Then we realize when we continued through the practice of continued discrimination, or through the continued practice of discrimination, we realize that nature is a compound. And what is it doing? Just showing this variety of things, external things, to the Purusha. And Purusha is the witness, not doing anything, just watching. Purusha is a witness. And all these things, the nature is just showing the Purusha. Nature is not the Lord. Nature is not the master. Nature is a servant. It's just showing to the Purusha. And all the combinations of the nature are simply for the sake of showing these panorama to the Purusha. Purusha, the enthroned king within. The self, the Atman, is the master. Remember we have said that the chariot so many times. Who is the rider in the chariot? The Atman. All this, what's happening in the nature is showing only all this, it's all for the sake of showing it to the Purusha, the Atman. When discrimination comes by long practice, fear ceases and the mind attains isolation, mind attains freedom. When discrimination comes by long practice, fear ceases. Why? Fear comes from identification, from attachment. If there is no identification, if there is no attachment, there won't be any fear. Why do we say fear comes from attachment? Because we identify with certain things, we see others as different, separate from us, different from us. And when there is the idea of separation, we fear. If there is only one thing, what is there to fear? Whom to fear? There is nobody else. There is nobody in the universe other than me. Whom to fear? Because we identify with this body and mind, with the certain people, certain things, certain places, identification comes, then us and they comes. And then there's fear. When there is no identification, no attachment, there's no fear. So here, what Swamiji says is almost like a summary of the two previous sutras, that the mind is showing all this for the sake of Purusha. Mind is not it's a combination, and Purusha is the real master. So all what is again and again Patanjali is saying this one: have constant, continuous discrimination. Discriminate, reason out. So we see that the tools that he uses here to get the last stage, kaivalya, liberation, is discrimination and detachment, viveka and vairagya. When we started on the journey, right at the beginning, start on the path of yoga, you are asked to use Viveka and Vairagya, discrimination and detachment. We start with Viveka and Vairagya, we come out of the path also through Viveka and Vairagya. Only the difference is, the earlier it was more on a grosser level. Here it's very high, very extremely subtle level. The things that we have reasoned out, it's not ordinary gross things. We are reasoning out about extremely subtle impression, subtle things. Then we come to the next sutra, 27. Tachidreshu pratyandarani samskarebhyaha. The thoughts that arise as obstructions to that are from the impressions. The thoughts that arise as obstructions to that, to what? To attainment of liberation, freedom, kaivalya, are from the impressions. Now the yogi is trying to get established in the state, in the reality. He's trying to remain established in the reality, but slips down. Again and again back to the realm of illusion. It is not the gross illusion that we ordinary people experience. No, very high, subtle realm, subtle kind of illusion. Every time a distraction occurs, when the mind moves away from the reality. It's like Sri Ramakrishna gives the example of the needle of the balance. Nowadays, if you say that nobody will understand, in the early days, there's a balance with the two spans and there's a needle. The needle has to be, or again, scales with holding on the, weighing the things down and holding the needle should be in one line. So when the needle moves a little this way or that way, the mind is distracted. All the distraction occurs when the mind moves away from that reality, even for a very short time. Now, why does the mind move away from the reality? Even at this advanced stage, we think the yogi has advanced a lot, has progressed a lot, and almost has got glimpses of the reality. Why does the mind again move away? Because past impressions are still present. Maybe in a very dormant state condition. Past impressions are there. So any relaxation of effort, they come up into the conscious level. At present, they are dormant, they are in the unconscious mind or subconscious mind. But the moment you relax your effort in discrimination and detachment, they come up to the conscious level and disturb. And these impressions that come up from within are greater obstacles on the path than the obstacles that come from external world or from the conscious mind. Then there are many obstacles on the spiritual path. Ordinary what we obstacles we say on the early stages, that is nothing compared to the obstacles the subtle obstacles that we find, the yogi finds on the advanced stage. For example, in the Vedanta Sara, they have given different obstacles that you find to the path of meditation. They like falling asleep while sitting for meditation, distracting the mind, going this way and that way. Then don't feel like meditating. And the last one is Rasa Swada, want to enjoy. Enjoy what? Some spiritual experiences. You get joy from that. You don't want to move forward. You get stuck there. You are enjoying that spiritual experience. I felt so peaceful. Well, that's fine. Go forward. But we don't want to. We get stuck there. That is also an obstacle. we can see similar, a comparison we can say almost, in Sri Ramakrishna's life when he was practicing the Advaita sadhana. Todapuri asked him to meditate, take the mind higher and higher or deeper and deeper into the form, go beyond forms and go into the formless, attributeless Brahman. He tried. The moment he tried to concentrate, it is not a problem for him. The mind completely left the external world. Mind went and settled on the form of the Divine Mother Kali. The mind refused to go forward. He's enjoying the form of the Mother Kali. So he tried again and again, and at last he said, no, I can't. It's impossible. What? Todapuri said, what? Impossible? He wanted to make him concentrate again deeply, sharp. So he looked around, found a piece of broken glass on the floor, picked it up and pierced or pricked between the eyebrows and asked Sri Ramakrishna to concentrate there. And Sri Ramakrishna describes later what happened then. He said he again collected his mind, concentrated, and the moment he concentrated, again the blissful form of the Divine Mother came. The mind is refusing to go beyond the form, but then he used the power of discrimination like a sword and cut that form and went beyond. The mind got lost. Then there's no more mind. The mind became no mind. The mind lost. There's nothing for the mind to. The mind needs something to hold on to. There's nothing. The mind became lost, and he lost consciousness. So that is also an obstacle. The subtle enjoyment of spiritual pleasures, spiritual enjoyment. It's not harmful, but that is an obstruction or obstacle to the final realization. If you want freedom, liberation, kaivalya, that's also an obstacle. Our true nature is peaceful. On that peaceful mind, we have brought in all the impressions from external world. Some may be good impressions, some may be bad impressions. If you have got good impressions, the mind gets colored good. That is, it's covering. It's covering maybe just like white clouds. Whether it is white cloud or dark cloud, the sun is being hidden. So when the impressions, good or bad, we are hiding that reality. But we think that we need all these things, good impressions, external world, for our happiness. So we go on collecting them without realizing that they are all, we are adding more and more obstacles to our attainment of that, our goal, liberation. Swamiji says, all the various ideas that arise, making us believe that we require something external to make us happy, are obstructions to that perfection. See, all the various ideas that arise, making us believe that we require something external to make us happy, are obstructions. Purusha is happiness and blessedness by its own nature. Purusha, the self, is existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute bliss. By its nature, it doesn't need anything else to make it happy, make it blissful. But that knowledge is covered over by past impressions. These impressions have to work themselves out. So all these impressions, all that we get from external world, they're covering, they're making coating after coating. The more impressions we get from the external world, the more covers we are putting on that over the self. Self is not being revealed. But when we don't identify with these impressions, we remain free. The thing is, we always identify. Some things we get from the external world. The moment a thought aside all the impressions that through the five senses we bring in, and we identify with them. And the moment we identify, we put one more color, one more coating. When we remove all this identification, then what remains is the pure self, without any bias, without any prejudice, that pure I. Now we have got so much of identification. We identify with our job, with our position, with our place of work, place of residence. We identify with all this. I am a seat decider. I live in this area. I work in this place. I'm a police officer. I'm a minister. I'm prime minister of the country. It's only for a short time. Or I will say I am a nun. That's this body, the mind, not the I. I is free. If you remove all this identification, what remains? That pure I. And to remove all this identification, to make sure that we don't get identified, we had to be always alert. We had to be always aware of the things, of the impressions that come from the world. And when the impressions rise up from the unconscious or subconscious mind, and they try to disturb us, we had to reason out. That happened last year. When that happened years ago, why should I worry it now? So and so said that to me. When? So many years ago. The moment I remember that, I get angry. All the good impressions don't disturb us. It's a negative impression, negative thoughts, negative ideas that disturb us so much. And one negative idea, bring in another negative idea. And then before we realize, we have got a huge pile of negative thoughts and ideas within our mind, which is disturbing us continuously. So we have to use the reasoning power all the time. When we think, when we bring an impression, is it good for me? Is it going to disturb me? Why should I identify with that? We keep on reasoning out. If it is something which has happened, some idea coming from the subconscious mind, something happened years ago. It happened, it was over, it's past. Why should I bother about it now? I move forward. But we have got the habit. Oh, it is all because of the fault of my parents. They did like this, that's why I'm like this. Don't want to take any responsibility for our behavior. Or the teachers, the system, everything is wrong, except me. We have to take responsibility for our behavior. We have to reason out. Why should I do like this? I'm not that. Or why remove the identification? And for that, always have to keep the reasoning power ablaze within us. What we often do is we bring the past to the present and brood over it. Or bring the future to the present and worry about it. What's going to happen? We are not in the present anytime, either in the past or in the future. Bring the past to the present, or bring future to the present and worry, brood or worry. Be in the present. And for all that, we need constant vigilance, in order to overcome the past impressions and old habits. And even the seeds of those impressions are burned out, we are in danger. So anytime they come up to the surface level, they may create new situations, new challenges, new temptations, and we will be in trouble. So that's why imitation of Christ, there's a saying, alertness and awareness, two terms. We always have alertness and awareness. What sort of things are coming inside? It's our mind. It's not a junk yard that all the junk you can bring in. Be aware what you are bringing in from external world. When we come to the Next sutra. Hanamesham kleshavaduktam. Their destruction is in the same manner as of the kleshas, ignorance, egoism, etc., as said before. Their destruction, the destruction of these obstructions. The previous sutra said, thoughts that arise as obstructions are from the past impression. How do you remove those impressions, past impressions? So that is what he's Patanjali saying here. Their destruction is in the same manner as that of the kleshas. Kleshas are ignorance, egoism, etc., that we dealt in the second chapter, long time back. You may have forgotten what kleshas are. Kleshas are pain-bearing obstructions. That's how it is translated. They are ignorance. There are 5 of them. Ignorance, avidya. Egoism, asmita. Raga, attachment. Dvesha, aversion. And abhinivesha, clinging to life. These are the 5 pain-bearing obstructions that we dealt in the second chapter. How we removed those, or what we had to do to remove these things. The same method Patanjali is saying we use to remove these impressions that is obstructing now. The impressions that come up as obstructions to the attainment of Kaivalya. We are almost reaching the top. Almost we have reached the summit, but just a little bit away. Again, the impressions come as obstruction. How to get rid of them? Use the same method. Now, how to prevent the emergence of distractions from the past impressions? That's the trouble. In the same way as we described. The same discipline. And in that we saw in the 5 kleshas, starting with avidya, ignorance, egoism, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life. Ignorance is the root cause. Because of ignorance. Ignorance means what? You have forgotten your real nature. And your real nature is bliss. You are that Purusha, I. I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, but I am that blissful self. That we have forgotten. We are ignorant of that. And because of that, we identify, next comes egoism. Identify with the body-mind complex. And then comes attachment. Attachment to things that gives pleasure. Of course, if you are attached to things that give pleasure, naturally things that give pain, you'll have aversion towards that. Attachment and aversion. And then comes clinging to life. You want to extend that life. Nobody wants to die. And all this because ignorance. Why is it that we are afraid of death? Death is the greatest fear we have. Because we think that we are this body. We think that once the body goes, we cease to exist. The body ceases to exist, but I continues. The self is not death. What does Sri Krishna says? It doesn't come into existence. In the Gita, Sri Krishna says in the 2nd chapter, it doesn't come into existence. It never ceases to be. It's always there. So the main effort is to acquire the ability to maintain the sharp power of discrimination, so that the force of avidya, ignorance, can be checked. The discriminative power has to be kept sharp and powerful. So we had to practice this with great faith and vigor. The past impressions had to be completely burned up. Otherwise, they may come up anytime and raise their head. And how do these impressions and thoughts become powerful? Because we give importance to them. We give attention. We pay attention to them. We show interest in them. The moment we show interest, we pay attention, and they become stronger. If you don't pay attention, if you are not interested, if you are not interested, you won't pay attention. And if you don't pay attention, slowly, they will die out. So use our reasoning power, discriminative power, and stop the impressions becoming stronger, powerful. By detachment, make them weak, powerless, and gradually they become silenced. Ignore them. Even the seeds of those impressions, when they are in the latent form, they have to even to be burned up through the power of discrimination. Otherwise, they may sprout up again. We often say, "Oh, I have never thought of these things. Where did this idea come from?" Deep from within, just there. As long as they are even in the seed form, the seeker is not safe. There's always a danger. And unexpected stimuli can bring them up to life. So how are we to deal with these impressions? We can detect them only when it comes to the surface level. When you come to the conscious level, in the unconscious level, subconscious level, you are not able to identify them. So what will you do? We don't even know what sort of impressions are coming up, when they are coming up. We have no idea. So these great teachers say there are two ways to deal with them. Remain completely undisturbed by anything. So we have to have always an alert mind, watchful about the impressions coming up, and don't be disturbed by whatever the impressions. So that needs a very strong mind and very strong will. We have to tell ourselves, no, whatever be, I won't be disturbed. Just by saying it doesn't happen unless you have very strong mind. You have got a very strong mind and strong willpower, then we can say, I won't be disturbed by whatever the impressions, whatever happens, I won't be disturbed. But most people are not able to do that. So what is the way for them? They say, surrender to a higher power, a higher ideal, and seek divine protection. Say surrender to God, seeks God's protection. So through constant vigilance, awareness, alertness, we will be able to overcome the impressions coming up and disturbing us. So we can't just afford to be daydreaming, be floating through the life. No, we had to be alert. We had to be always conscious of what we are thinking, what we are doing, trying to catch the thoughts as they come up into the surface level. So these are the two disciplines. Again and again, Patanjali is saying now, practice Viveka and Vairagya. Viveka, discrimination, and Vairagya, non-attachment. Through that, that's the only way to remove the obstructions that stand between us and the final goal of Kaivalya. Thank you.
There's time for question and answers. I'm invited to, and those joining us via Zoom, we can hear you if you want to jump in and ask a question. I might just get things going. Next Friday night in our spiritual discussion session, we'll we'll be delving into mindfulness, and I'm just relating mindfulness, which is such a popular technique now, and how it's closely aligned with this alertness and awareness.
Yes.
And then so on, and so closely aligned, of course, to Raja Yoga, the whole idea of, well, it's not just being aware of what's coming up into the mind, but trying to, well, I like the expression they used that if you're being tormented by your memories and other, especially negative feelings and thoughts, then it's like you're only half conscious of what's around you. And by that, you're not really, the richness of life is impeded. So I'm relating that to this Raja Yoga too, that, well, I guess with the meditation, yes.
You're bringing the past to the present and brooding
Yes,
over what happened.
yeah.
Instead, we had to say, it's past, it's over. I'm going to be here in the present moment.
And then I can see, well, as we know with meditation, it's like a clearing process. So you would hope that unavoidably all the memories, the negative feelings and that come up, they're going to lessen and they won't torment you as much as you progress along
as you go forward.
the
early days
the meditation path.
Or practicing meditation for a few months or few years, you can see more and more disturbing thoughts will come up. But that they say, don't get worried about that. It's good they come up because it's a clearing process. It's clearing that all these impressions from the deep are coming up to the conscious level. Just observe them and let it go. Don't show any interest in them. Don't try to analyze and relieve all those impressions or happenings. Then you are paying attention to become stronger. Ignore it. Say it's past, let it go. That's the only way to get rid of all of them.
Well, I was remembering, Gayatriprana ji, that when I first got interested in meditation, I wasn't interested in God as such. I was a bit averse to the whole concept of God. But luckily, I got a book from the library that just served the purpose for what I was prepared to accept. And I remember the techniques in that book were as simple as this to start with. It just said to sit outside and just look at the clouds or look at the sky. And I looking back now, I realized that was like a mindfulness or be in the present moment sort of exercise, and very simple, but very effective. You know, really responded to that. That got me on the way.
Yeah, if
So
you look
it
in
can be as
front,
simple
you'll
as
be
that.
seeing all different things, but looking up sky, what you will see nothing else to disturb you.
My friends thought it was rather weird, but I didn't mind. Yes, kind of.
And I'd like to ask two questions. The first is, when negative thoughts come up, are we trying to just erase them eventually or just ignore them? Because as always talks about when negative, you always hear the idea of trying to erase things that are painful to you. And or do you just end up becoming resilient and ignoring them so they become, you know, you don't hear them as much? And the second question is if you have a sense of self-doubt creeping up, is that because just your old past impressions surfacing, or are they something to do with the present itself, you know?
The first question, don't try to erase the impression, because if you are trying to erase the negative thoughts, you're concentrating on the negative thoughts. They become stronger. The only way is ignore them. I don't want, and as Swami Sarvagatananda used to say, write a notice on the door of your mind, no admission for negative thoughts. I don't want you. Get out. And then ignore it. The moment you pay attention, pay any interest, even if it is to throw it out. The moment you pay attention and show interest, they become strong. So ignore it. That's the best thing. And the other one, self-doubt, it's a result of past impressions coming up. The present situation may be given as a trigger for the past impressions to come up.
Just two questions. One is with the impressions, it takes a long time to get over the impressions. So having getting your memory shorter and shorter is a good thing. Meaning if you don't remember things, is that something telling you that you're in the right direction? And the second thing is, they say pranayama helps you erase impressions. Is how much of that helps?
Pranayama helps to erase impressions.
Yeah. It's just trying to burn your samskaras little by little.
I don't know about that.
Okay.
But the impressions, not many impressions coming up means you haven't gone deep. But because the more the mind goes deeper, the impressions will come. Because we all have got a lot of impressions in the unconscious and subconscious mind. And they have to come up we have to clear all that. It's a lot of junk within. About the pranayama erasing impressions, I have no idea.
Regarding this I, at the end, everything is changing. We grow, we are born, we are gone, and old age and the die. But the I actually is not, we are considering the I as a body. And that is the way problem arises. Only time the I is gone is when we are dead, because that is all the time eternal. That is Atma, as we say.
The I come confined within this body-mind complex,
That's
becomes one with the infinite I. Like the river becoming one with the ocean. But we are afraid.
Yes.
Because of our identification with the body-mind complex. We have identified with the body-mind complex, so we are afraid to lose that identity.
And the second about the pranayama, what he said, actually, there was a few years ago, some Swami had come out, yoga practitioner, and he was telling that, I can cure the depression by the yoga practice. And out of that time, somebody had asked, because all doctors were there, and somebody asked him, how many members are coming? And say, 150 or something. And that the other chapter has asked the question that out of crores of people, 150 people. So what is the ratio? It is negligible. But when they are doing the exercise of the yoga, of course it lives, because you are that time you're forgetting about it. And when you are doing any sort of exercise, your adrenaline and noradrenaline are pumping. And that is the reason why the exercise is helping you in the depression.
Helping in the depression, but it won't erase samskaras. The impressions, it won't erase impressions. That's what you said, isn't it? The erasing the impression. Impression.
It is a depression.
No, impressions. Depression helps in the breathing, and meditation, of course, will help a little for the time being at least. But impressions, I don't know, I haven't heard it.
Any more questions? Okay, be a few announcements. This week we have the yoga class on Thursday from 10 a.m. we've got the fortnightly spiritual evening discussion led by Gayatriprana. It's coming Friday night. Next Sunday, we have the monthly talk on Mundaka Upanishad, given by Sri Sarada Math. And also to let you know, when you come next Sunday, all going to plan, there'll be a different layout in here. We're having an audio visual rearrangement, upgrade, plus we're having some electrical work done. We need to get some safety work done, the switch box and so on. So I'm hoping too that in the process of all of that, everything will be working properly. Once you disturb all of this and some new equipment coming in, got to quickly make sure, I mean, we've got experts helping us, so I'm assuming they're going to help get me up to speed with the new equipment and everything, that everything's working well. So just to let you know, the different, and we would say a better layout that you'll see by next weekend. But just a bit of a fingers crossed that everything's working well by then. Anyway, if it's not, it'll be definitely by the following weekend. So thanks for coming, and thanks to those joining us via Zoom. And we'll see you next week. And I don't know if you play there.